Alright, so if we're looking at the lesson plan that our group did, we based it off of Secondhand Smoke, Whom Do You Trust, 2.4 of this. And so the original objectives of this are parallel to ours. This is all about evaluating the argument of articles on the internet that talk about secondhand smoke. So if we look at our lesson plan, our content focus is very similar. Students will describe differing views about secondhand smoke. They will analyze and interpret arguments made from the data about secondhand smoke. The only thing that we did not include is writing persuasively. We took out the written project at the end. They're just going to be doing a handout instead, but they will be speaking persuasively as they learn how to do this through the analyzing arguments. So our essential literacy strategy focus. Students will practice reading a range of different viewpoints on a topic, evaluating different perspectives, and drawing and defending their own conclusions. This happens throughout the analysis of articles and informational pieces. The related skills they will use. Students will practice evaluating the credibility of sources. So here are the standards we used. We did include an ELD standard just because it is applicable, because these students will be evaluating how well writers and speakers use language to support ideas and arguments with details or evidence depending on modality, text type, purpose, audience topics, and content area. This is the most basic version of this, just the emerging skills, and it gets more complex for the students that are more proficient. But our other standards relate to citing textual evidence. This is what they'll be doing in the handout. Evaluating arguments. They'll be discussing this, addressing whether arguments are valid and evidence is relevant. They will write arguments to support claims and analysis of substantive topics or texts. So the handout is a prompt that asks questions relating to this, and they respond with evidence from the text. And then initiate and participate effectively in collaborative discussions. This is the majority of what we will be doing. So our learning objectives, similar to what was mentioned above, describe the differing views about secondhand smoke. This will happen in a class discussion. Analyze and interpret arguments made from the data about secondhand smoke. This happens in a class discussion as well as the handout for the formative assessment. So our language functions, they will describe, analyze, and interpret. Language demands, we were recommended by our Senior 3 SB to do both syntax and discourse, just so that we are prepared to think about those things. So our vocabulary is credibility, citation. These are ones that are Tier 2 vocabulary words. Also moving into Tier 3 with just English, because we are always looking at the credibility. And citations happen across most professions and studies. But then we get to Tier 3 words. These are words for accessibility of the text, Surgeon General, secondhand smoke, government agency. So syntax, there's different structures between informational pieces that they're reading and rhetorical texts. Rhetorical texts usually have a thesis, whereas informational texts are just going to be a layout of data. And then they will also be interpreting visual representations of data, so graphs and charts, which some students may not have done before. Discourse students will be sharing research findings with one another in groups regarding differing views on secondhand smoke. Some students may not have begun conversation yet, such as newcomers and English language learners. And we're practicing this for future academic settings. So these are the resources and materials. This just includes things they'll need to access these articles and the things we'll be discussing. And we'll also be handing them out a worksheet to be working on. So prior knowledge, before this they did have reading the night before and the day before. And there are other lessons that have been a part of this unit in other classes and in our class. Students may not have been aware of the different stakeholders involved in the smoking ban policy discussion. So this is something they're still learning about. And they may think that there'd be only one correct interpretation of statistics. So we are making sure they learn how to do this. So the transition is they will have read So they have some background knowledge, and we're just accessing that with a discussion. And the hook and purpose for learning, we're going to do a KWL chart about what they've learned so far, and we're moving on to secondhand smoke rather than just smoking. So we want to develop their knowledge. So the modeling is the instructor activating that knowledge, prompting questions for discussion. And the class discussion will be in groups, and this can be done strategically to help ELLs. The teacher will also circulate the room as we move into guided instruction and practice. These questions will be prompted so that students have something to discuss. And our specific students with needs will have a graphic organizer and a vocabulary guide for accessing the texts. Independent practice is the research and writing conclusions on the handout. This will be discussed later, but individually students are researching and properly citing sources and making sure the information they find is valid. And the teacher will circulate the room in each of these steps, and there will be additional sentence frames on the handouts for the students who are still emerging English learners or maybe have ADD. I do have a couple of students who have attention deficit disorder in my observation, and this definitely helps them a lot. So closure is a closing discussion of the value of searching for different perspectives on a topic that has powerful and opposing stakeholders. So we're asking the class to consider the things that they have found, whether the arguments were valid, what people say when their arguments aren't valid, and analyzing the difference between informational and opinionative pieces, and then just taking their final impressions before they leave the classroom. Thank you so much.